Roy Lindley DeVecchio. In March 2006, Brooklyn District Attorney Charles Hines stood before reporters and announced what he called the most stunning example of official corruption that I have ever seen. The man at the center of this indictment was not a mobster, but a decorated FBI supervisor with 33 years of service. Roy Lindley DeVecchio, once celebrated as one of the Bureau's most successful organized crime fighters, now faced 4 counts of second-degree murder, accused of helping his mob informant kill 4 people during the bloody mafia wars of the 1980s and 1990s. DeVecchio had an important role in bringing down New York's 5 families, using a violent Colombo crime family captain named Gregory Scarpa Sr. as his prized informant. But prosecutors now alleged that their relationship had crossed the line. DeVecchio wasn't just using Scarpa for information, they claimed. He was feeding him intelligence that led directly to murders and accepting bribes of cash and jewelry. Yet just 18 months later, in a Brooklyn courtroom filled with former FBI agents, all charges would be dismissed because of allegations that the star witness had lied. The truth of what happened between DeVecchio and Scarpa remains one of the most controversial and debated questions in the history of American law enforcement. This is the story of how an FBI hero became associated with the very criminals he was sworn to bring down. Roy Lindley DeVecchio was born on April 18, 1940, in Fresno, California. Known throughout his career as Lynn, he joined the FBI soon after graduating from George Washington University in the early 1960s. After 3 years with the Bureau, he was transferred to the Organized Crime Squad in Manhattan, where he would spend the next 3 decades of his life involved in the brutal world of New York's mafia families. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, DeVecchio had become a key player in the FBI's war against organized crime. His colleagues described him as dedicated and willing to do whatever it took to bring down mob bosses. During his 33-year career, he won 28 FBI awards and commendations and was made a member of the NYPD Honor Legion. DeVecchio's specialty was handling confidential informants. In 1980, he took on what would become the most important and controversial assignment of his career. He became the handler for Gregory Scarpa Sr., a Colombo crime family captain who had been an FBI informant since the 1960s. Gregory Scarpa Sr., nicknamed the Grim Reaper and the Mad Hatter, was one of the most feared killers in New York organized crime. Born on May 8, 1928, in Brooklyn, Scarpa had grown up in the working-class neighborhood of Bensonhurst. By the 1950s, he had joined the Colombo crime family, rising to become a capo and chief enforcer for boss Carmine Persico. Scarpa was believed to have killed between 80 and 120 people during his criminal career, often bragging that he stopped counting after 50. In 1962, after being arrested for armed robbery, Scarpa made a deal to avoid prosecution. He would become an FBI informant. This began a 30-year relationship with the Bureau, but after a dispute over payment for this second FBI assignment in 1966, Scarpa's relationship with the Bureau was no longer the same, and he was dropped as a confidential informant in 1975. But in 1980, DeVecchio was determined to bring him back. Scarpa had refused contact with the FBI for 5 years, but DeVecchio persuaded him to cooperate again. What would follow was a relationship that prosecutors would later describe as an unholy alliance, while DeVecchio and his defenders called it the necessary price of taking down the mob's most powerful leaders. From 1980 onwards, DeVecchio and Scarpa developed what would become one of the most productive and controversial informant relationships in FBI history. DeVecchio was running the squad investigating the Colombo crime family, and Scarpa provided intelligence that prosecutors credited with helping secure the convictions of major mob figures, including Colombo boss Carmine Persico, Lucchese family boss Tony Corallo, and Genovese boss Tony Salerno in the Mafia Commission case. According to Linda Shiro, Scarpa's longtime girlfriend of nearly 30 years, DeVecchio became a regular presence in their lives. She testified that the FBI agent would visit their homes in Bensonhurst for meetings with Scarpa, often twice a week. These weren't brief professional encounters. Shiro claimed she would sit in the kitchen during these meetings, sometimes for hours, listening to DeVecchio and Scarpa discuss mob business. The relationship appeared to blur professional boundaries. DeVecchio would frequently dine with Scarpa and his family at the mobster's home, much to the concern of some of his FBI colleagues. Shiro testified that Scarpa showered DeVecchio with gifts: an antique piece of jewelry for the agent's mother, a Cabbage Patch doll for his daughter, trays of eggplant parmesan, bottles of wine, cash payments, and stolen jewelry. According to prosecutors, Scarpa paid DeVecchio more than $66,000 over the years, along with prepaid hotel rooms stocked with champagne and prostitutes. But the question that would haunt DeVecchio's career was not what Scarpa gave him, but what he gave Scarpa in return. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, some of DeVecchio's FBI colleagues began to suspect something was wrong. Scarpa seemed to have the ability to avoid arrest despite his continued criminal activities. His associates spoke of a law enforcement source he called the girlfriend, who gave him information as good as a free pass to kill. The suspicions intensified during the Third Colombo War, which erupted in 1991. The war began when Victor Orena, who had been named acting boss while Carmine Persico was imprisoned, decided he should be boss in his own right, rather than simply holding the position for Persico's son. When Orena tried to have Persico's allies killed, including consigliere Carmine Sessa, a brutal conflict happened that would claim 12 lives. Scarpa sided with the Persico faction, and prosecutors would later allege that DeVecchio actively helped him hunt down Orena supporters. FBI agent Chris Favo, who worked under DeVecchio, became increasingly alarmed by what he was witnessing. He believed DeVecchio was protecting Scarpa and possibly feeding him information about rivals and potential informants. In the early 1990s, Favo's concerns led to an internal FBI investigation by the Office of Professional Responsibility, OPR. The investigation examined DeVecchio's relationship with Scarpa from 1994 to 1996, but cleared him of wrongdoing. 19 soldiers from the Orena faction had their murder convictions reversed or charges thrown out after their lawyers argued that DeVecchio's corrupt relationship with Scarpa tainted the evidence against them. The defense attorneys said that DeVecchio actively helped Scarpa hunt down and kill their clients' targets, making the deaths caused by their clients acts of self-defense rather than murder. In March 2006, the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office indicted DeVecchio on 4 counts of second-degree murder. Prosecutors alleged that between 1984 and 1992, DeVecchio had provided Scarpa with confidential FBI information that led directly to 4 murders. The first one was of Mary Bari, who had been the girlfriend of Alphonse "Alley Boy" Persico, the family's consigliere. When Alphonse Persico failed to show up for sentencing on an extortion conviction in 1980, he became a fugitive, and Bari was one of the few people who knew his whereabouts. According to the indictment, a few days before September 25, 1984, DeVecchio informed Scarpa that Bari had been speaking to federal law enforcement agents and expressed concern that she would reveal Persico's location. DeVecchio allegedly told Scarpa, "You have to take care of this. She's going to be a problem." Scarpa responded, "Don't worry, I'll take care of the matter." On September 24, 1984, Bari was lured to the Wimpy Boys Social Club in Brooklyn, thinking she was invited to a job interview. When she arrived, Scarpa's son, Gregory Jr., grabbed her and forced her to the floor. Scarpa Sr. then shot her 3 times in the head. Her body was wrapped in canvas, placed in a car trunk, and driven about 2 miles away, where it was dumped in the street beneath an elevated subway line, just 2 blocks from Scarpa's house. Joseph "Joe" Brewster DiDomenico, 45, was a member of Scarpa's crew and had committed numerous bank robberies with him. But by 1987, DiDomenico had become a liability. He was using drugs heavily, committing crimes without involving Scarpa, and had reportedly embraced born-again Christianity. In early spring 1986, prosecutors alleged, DeVecchio met with Scarpa and warned him about DiDomenico's increasingly troublesome behavior and drug use. The message was clear. DiDomenico was a threat who needed to be eliminated. Linda Shiro testified that DeVecchio told Scarpa, "You know, we gotta take care of this guy before he starts talking." On September 17, 1987, DiDomenico was shot and killed in a car in Brooklyn. Scarpa's son, Gregory Jr., and others carried out the hit. Patrick Porco was just 18 years old and one of the best friends of Linda Shiro's son, Joey Scarpa. On Halloween night, 1989, Porco had been present during a violent incident that resulted in the shooting death of 17-year-old Dominic Masseria. Porco was in a car with Joey Scarpa and FBI informant Joseph Simone when the shooting occurred. In May 1990, detectives at the 62nd Precinct questioned Porco about the Masseria murder. According to prosecutors, DeVecchio contacted Scarpa to warn him that Porco had been speaking to authorities about Joey Scarpa's involvement in the shooting. On Memorial Day 1990, Porco was found shot dead. He had been shot once in the mouth, a traditional mafia mark identifying him as a rat. The teenager had desperately tried to defend himself, with bullets striking his arms and hands as he attempted to block the shots. The fourth and final murder occurred during the height of the Third Colombo War. Lorenzo Lampassi, 66, was a soldier loyal to Victor Orina's faction in the bloody power struggle. On May 22, 1992, according to Shiro's testimony, an angry Scarpa told DeVecchio that Lampassi was spreading rumors that Scarpa was an FBI informant. "I need you to find out exactly where he lives and what time he leaves in the morning," Scarpa demanded. DeVecchio allegedly responded, "I'll take care of it." Soon after, the FBI agent provided Scarpa with a slip of paper containing Lampassi's home address, a description of his car, and the exact time he left for work each morning. 4 a.m. The information came from FBI surveillance operations. Armed with this intelligence, Scarpa and his hit team pulled up alongside Lampassi as he closed the gate to his parking lot one morning. They shot him to death in his driveway at precisely 4 a.m., exactly when DeVecchio had said he would be there. These four murders painted a picture of an FBI agent who had allegedly become so entangled with his informant that he was no longer simply gathering intelligence, but actively participating in eliminating threats. Prosecutors argued that DeVecchio had essentially become Scarpa's partner in crime, using his FBI resources and authority to help a serial killer continue his reign of terror, while claiming to be fighting organized crime. The investigation that would eventually lead to DeVecchio's indictment began with a politician and a journalist. In February 2005, Representative William Delahunt, a Democrat from Massachusetts serving on the House Judiciary Committee, brought allegations involving DeVecchio to the attention of Brooklyn District Attorney Charles Hines. Delahunt had been investigating FBI corruption in organized crime cases, including the notorious Whitey Bulger scandal in Boston. Investigative journalist Peter Lance had also been pursuing the DeVecchio story, publishing the book Cover Up in 2004 that detailed the alleged corruption. At DeVecchio's arraignment, Noel Downey, chief of the DA's Rackets Bureau, acknowledged that Cover Up had been a wonderful springboard to understand who the parties were and in what direction the investigation should go. The key to cracking the case was Linda Shiro, Scarpa's girlfriend of nearly 3 decades. For years, Shiro had been too afraid to speak out about what she knew. During the FBI's 1994 to 1996 Office of Professional Responsibility investigation, she had provided only limited information, claiming she stayed out of the kitchen when Scarpa and DeVecchio met. But prosecutors believed she knew far more than she was saying. With Scarpa dead from AIDS-related complications in 1994, and with assurances that authorities would protect her life, Shiro finally agreed to cooperate fully with the Brooklyn DA's investigation. Starting in March 2006, the DA's office began paying her $2,200 per month for food and rent. Over the next 6 months, she provided detailed testimony to a grand jury about the DeVecchio-Scarpa relationship, claiming she had been present for many of their meetings and had overheard DeVecchio provide the information that led to all 4 murders. On March 30th, 2006, a Brooklyn grand jury returned an indictment charging DeVecchio with 4 counts of second-degree murder. At a dramatic press conference, District Attorney Hines announced the charges, calling the case the most stunning example of official corruption that I have ever seen. The investigation, he said, had uncovered a troubling path of confidential leaks, payoffs, and death. The trial of Roy Lindley DeVecchio began in October 2007, with much of New York's legal and law enforcement community watching closely. At DeVecchio's request, the trial was being heard by a judge rather than a jury. State Supreme Court Justice Gustin Reichbach would decide his fate. Lead prosecutor Michael Vecchione opened the case by describing the relationship between DeVecchio and Scarpa as an apparatus that furthered their careers on either side of the law. One of the byproducts of the apparatus was murder, Vecchione told the court. For the first 8 days of testimony, a parade of mob cooperators and FBI investigators testified about their suspicions concerning the DeVecchio-Scarpa relationship. FBI agents said they believed their colleague had steadily tilted in Scarpa's favor, possibly passing crucial information, but suspicion was all they offered. Not a single witness could directly place DeVecchio in any of the 4 murders. Then, on October 29, 2007, Linda Shiro took the stand. She described how DeVecchio had regularly visited the homes she shared with Scarpa in Bensonhurst, how she would sit in the kitchen during their meetings, and how DeVecchio had provided the information that led to all 4 murders. Defense attorney Douglas Grover began his cross-examination by attacking Shiro's credibility and motives. He portrayed her as a paid government witness, desperate for money, and working on a tell-all book deal about Scarpa. She's someone who's so desperate and so financially driven she'll say anything, Grover argued. She's capable of manufacturing anything about anybody, anytime. But the defense's most devastating evidence came not from cross-examination, but from an unexpected source. Journalist Tom Robbins of The Village Voice. On October 30th, 2007, Robbins published an article titled "Tall Tales of a Mafia Mistress" that would destroy the prosecution's case. 10 years earlier, in 1997, Robbins and mob expert Jerry Capisi had interviewed Shiro for a book project about the mafia that never made it to print. They had promised her that her revelations would not appear in a news article or be credited to her. But Robbins had kept the audio tapes of those interviews, and what Shiro had told them in 1997 directly contradicted her current testimony in 3 of the 4 murders. When asked about the Lampassi murder in 1997, Shiro had insisted DeVecchio had nothing to do with it. "We were sitting there when she told Greg all about Larry Lampassi," she had said, referring to Scarpa's niece providing the information. Lynn did not tell. For the Bari and De Domenico murders, she had similarly denied DeVecchio's involvement. The only murder she had consistently linked to DeVecchio was the Patrick Porco killing. On November 1st, 2007, just days after Shiro's testimony, prosecutors listened to the 1997 tapes behind closed doors. The case collapsed immediately. Assistant District Attorney Michael Vecchione stood before Judge Reichbach and requested that all charges be dropped. "Had we been provided these tapes much earlier in the process, I dare say we wouldn't have been here," Vecchione said. Judge Reichbach granted the motion to dismiss, though not without comment. While he had no choice but to drop the charges, he expressed disgust with the FBI's long relationship with Scarpa, calling it a deal with the devil. As DeVecchio stood in the courthouse after hearing the news, applause filled the courtroom. Much of it from former FBI agents who had supported him throughout the trial. Because the charges were dismissed before trial concluded, there was no sentencing phase. DeVecchio walked free, cleared of all charges due to the principle of double jeopardy, which prevents a person from being tried twice for the same crime. However, the absence of a conviction did not erase the profound impact on the victims' families and the broader questions about justice. The families of the 4 murder victims were left with no closure. Mary Bari's relatives never saw anyone held accountable for her murder, beyond Gregory Scarpa, who died in prison. Patrick Porco's family mourned the loss of an 18-year-old whose only crime was being friends with the wrong people. Joseph DiDomenico's relatives were left to wonder if an FBI agent had signed his death warrant. Lorenzo Lampazzi's family had to accept that the very people sworn to protect citizens may have provided the intelligence that led to his execution. Beyond the individual victims, the case left a stain on the FBI's reputation and raised troubling questions about the use of violent criminals as informants. The 19 mobsters from the Orena faction who had their convictions overturned or charges dismissed based on DeVecchio's alleged corruption represented a wholesale failure of justice. Guilty men may have walked free, while the truth about what DeVecchio actually did remained unclear. Linda Shiro faced potential perjury charges for her contradictory testimony. The Brooklyn DA's office cut her loose as a cooperating witness, stopped paying her monthly stipend, and requested a special prosecutor to investigate her. She later told reporters, "I'm really sick about this. Really sick they can do this to me after I tried with my heart to really help them." She maintained that her courtroom testimony was the truth, arguing that what she told journalists years earlier wasn't under oath. Judge Reichbach appointed a lawyer to represent her regarding potential perjury charges, though it remains unclear if she was ever prosecuted. After his acquittal, DeVecchio returned to his life in Sarasota, Florida, where he lived in a gated community with his wife, Carolyn. He resumed his duties as president of the Homeowners Association and tried to rebuild his life after spending 18 months under indictment, including wearing a court-ordered monitoring device around his ankle for a year and a half. In 2011, DeVecchio co-authored a book with best-selling author Charles Brandt titled "We're Going to Win This Thing: The Shocking Frame-Up of a Mafia Crime Buster." The book presented DeVecchio's side of the story, portraying him as a dedicated FBI agent who was unfairly targeted by overzealous prosecutors, corrupt mob witnesses, and a disgruntled FBI colleague, Chris Favo, seeking revenge. In the book, DeVecchio maintained his innocence and defended his handling of Scarpa as the necessary price of bringing down the mob's most powerful leaders. For the last decade of his career before retirement, DeVecchio ran his own private investigations firm. The case left him with notable legal fees, and he has expressed anger at what he views as a politically motivated prosecution. "I'm angry, you bet. Still am," he told reporters after his acquittal. When asked who would play him in a movie, he suggested Mark Wahlberg. The DeVecchio case remains one of the most controversial chapters in FBI history, raising questions about the use of violent criminals as informants and whether the Bureau's "deal with the devil" was worth the cost. While DeVecchio was never convicted, the suspicion on him was never fully lifted. To his supporters, he was a hero who helped cripple New York's 5 families and was then betrayed by the system he served. To his critics, he represents everything wrong with the FBI's informant program, a story of how the line between cop and criminal can blur when the stakes are high and the relationships become too close. If you're still watching at this point, make sure you're subscribed. We cover stories like this every week, and your support helps us keep going. DeVecchio had blurred the line between informant handler and accomplice, but this next guy completely erased the line and sold his badge for cash and wine. John Morris. On June 27, 2013, a courtroom in Boston fell silent as a 68-year-old man with thinning gray hair took the witness stand in the trial of James "Whitey" Bulger, one of America's most notorious gangsters. John Morris, a former FBI supervisor who had once been entrusted with fighting organized crime in Boston, was about to do something remarkable. Confess to crimes that should have landed him in prison for life, yet walk away a free man. His testimony would reveal a level of FBI corruption so profound that it had allowed Bulger to operate with protection for decades, leaving a trail of 19 murder victims in his wake. Morris admitted, under oath, that he had taken $7,000 in cash bribes from Bulger, along with cases of expensive wine, a plane ticket for his mistress, and countless other gifts. He confessed to leaking information about confidential informants that directly led to their murders. He acknowledged living in an informant's apartment when his wife kicked him out, approving false FBI reports, and essentially granting Bulger and his partner Stephen Flemmi permission to commit any crimes short of murder. By his own admission, Morris said his FBI record was spotless, except for all of that. The most shocking part of all this was that Morris had been granted complete immunity from prosecution in 1998 in exchange for testifying against his former subordinate and best friend, FBI agent John Connolly. While Connolly would ultimately serve 19 years in prison for his role in protecting Bulger, Morris walked free, collected his full FBI pension, and went on to work as a wine consultant in Florida. His case is an example of how the justice system can fail when federal prosecutors prioritize convictions over accountability. This is the complete story of how an FBI supervisor became as corrupt as the criminals he was supposed to catch, and how he escaped justice by betraying everyone around him. John Morris was born in 1947 and grew up with ambitions of a career in law enforcement. Unlike John Connolly, who grew up in the rough streets of South Boston surrounded by gangsters and politicians, Morris came from a rather different background. He was studious, methodical, and a rule follower who seemed destined for middle management rather than the front lines of organized crime fighting. Morris joined the FBI and steadily climbed the ranks through competent work. In December 1977, he was put in charge of the Organized Crime Squad at the FBI's Boston field office, a promotion that should have been the crowning achievement of his career. He was now responsible for overseeing the FBI's efforts to break apart the Italian mafia and Irish mob operations that had been in Boston for decades. His direct reports included John Connolly, a flashy, ambitious agent who had made James Whitey Bulger and Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi as confidential informants. Morris was married to a woman named Rebecca, and he was a respectable federal agent with a stable family life. But beneath the surface, Morris was insecure and envious. He watched as Connolly received commendations for his work with high-level informants, while Morris was just the team manager. He wanted to be more than just processing paperwork. He wanted to be part of the action, to be respected and admired like his subordinate. The objects of Morris's envy and eventually his corruption were Bulger and Flemmi, two of the most dangerous criminals in Boston. Bulger had grown up in the South Boston housing projects and controlled the Winter Hill Gang, the dominant Irish mob organization in the city. Flemmi was a stone-cold killer with ties to both the Irish and Italian mobs. Together, they had been FBI informants since the 1970s, allegedly providing information about the Italian mafia in exchange for protection from prosecution. Morris first met Bulger in 1978 at a dinner Morris hosted at his home in Lexington, Massachusetts. It was supposed to be a professional meeting to discuss Bulger's role as an informant. Instead, it marked the beginning of Morris's descent into corruption. Over the coming years, Bulger and Flemmi would become regular visitors to Morris's home, dining with him and his wife, showering him with gifts, transforming the FBI supervisor from guardian of justice into an accomplice to murder. What made Morris particularly vulnerable to corruption was not just greed, but weakness of character. Unlike Connolly, who embraced his corrupt relationship with Bulger and seemed to take joy in it, Morris was filled with guilt and anxiety. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but he lacked the courage to stop. The corruption began slowly, with small compromises that seemed justifiable at the time. In February 1979, federal prosecutors were preparing to indict numerous members of the Winter Hill Gang for fixing horse races at East Coast racetracks. The massive investigation threatened to sweep up dozens of criminals, including the gang's boss, Howie Winter. Initially, Bulger and Flemmi were going to be part of this indictment. Morris and Connolly went to federal prosecutor Jeremiah O'Sullivan and personally asked him to drop charges against Bulger and Flemmi. Their argument was simple. These two men were providing intelligence about the Italian mafia and prosecuting them for relatively minor race-fixing charges would endanger the FBI's larger effort to bring down the mafia. O'Sullivan agreed, and Bulger and Flemmi walked free, while their associates faced prosecution. Bulger and Flemmi now knew they had protection at the highest levels of law enforcement. According to later testimony, Morris told them explicitly what they could get away with. At a dinner at his home in 1985, with wine flowing freely, Morris allegedly told Bulger and Flemmi, "You can do anything you want, as long as you don't clip anyone." Flemmi later testified that he and Bulger shook hands with Morris on this understanding. They had effectively been granted a license to commit any crime short of murder. But the corruption didn't stop there. By 1982, Morris was what he later described as thoroughly compromised. The defining moment came when Morris was sent to Glencoe, Georgia for FBI training on drug investigations. He was having an affair with his secretary, Debbie Noseworthy, and wanted her to visit him during the training. Rather than pay for her plane ticket himself, Morris called Connolly back in Boston and asked him to have Bulger come up with $1,000 for the ticket. Bulger obliged. This transaction was more than just a bribe. It became Morris's complete surrender to corruption. He had asked a murderous gangster to pay for his mistress's travel. When his wife, Rebecca, eventually found out about the affair and kicked him out, Morris moved into an apartment owned by another FBI informant. His personal life was in shambles, his marriage was broken, and he was now financially and emotionally dependent on the very criminals he was supposed to be investigating. Throughout the early 1980s, Morris accepted an escalating series of bribes from Bulger and Flemmi. There were envelopes stuffed with cash, delivered inside wooden boxes containing expensive imported wine. The gifts came so frequently that Bulger's Winter Hill Gang nicknamed Morris Vino because of his love of wine. Morris also received a silver-plated champagne bucket and countless other luxury items. By his own later admission, he accepted more than $7,000 in direct cash payments, along with gifts worth thousands more. In exchange for these bribes, Morris provided Bulger and Flemmi with protection. In 1980, when Massachusetts State Police planted a listening device in the Lancaster Street garage where Bulger and Flemmi operated, Morris or Connolly tipped them off about the surveillance. When informants from rival gangs provided information about Bulger and Flemmi's criminal activities, Morris ignored or hid the reports. Even after Morris was transferred to lead the Boston FBI's anti-drug task force in 1983, he remained an active accomplice to Connolly and Bulger's schemes. He continued to accept gifts, approve false reports that portrayed Bulger and Flemmi as productive informants, and shield them from investigation. By the late 1980s, some FBI agents were beginning to question what was happening. Robert Fitzpatrick, who served as Assistant Special Agent in Charge in Boston from 1981 to 1986, repeatedly requested that Bulger's informant status be revoked because of the obviously improper relationship between the gangster and his handlers. Morris refused each time. When Brian Halloran came forward as a government witness against Bulger in 1982, Fitzpatrick requested that Halloran be placed in witness protection. Again, Morris helped ensure the request was denied. The consequences of that decision would be fatal. While Morris's corruption involved numerous criminal acts like bribery, obstruction of justice, falsifying FBI reports, and more, the most serious crime he committed was his role in the murders of Brian Halloran and Michael Donahue. To understand the Halloran murder, one must first understand the Roger Wheeler case. Wheeler was a successful Oklahoma businessman and owner of World High-Lie, a gambling operation in Florida and Connecticut. What Wheeler didn't know was that Bulger and his associates had infiltrated his business and were skimming money from the operation. When Wheeler discovered the theft and began investigating, he effectively signed his own death warrant. On May 27, 1981, Roger Wheeler was shot to death outside a country club in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The killer was John Martirano, a Winter Hill Gang enforcer, but the murder had been orchestrated by Bulger and Flemmi. One of the men who knew about Bulger and Flemmi's involvement in Wheeler's murder was Brian Halloran, a low-level associate of the Winter Hill Gang who was known on the streets as Balloon Head. In early 1982, Halloran was facing his own legal troubles, as he had been indicted for first-degree murder by the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. Desperate to avoid prosecution and knowing information that could bring down major organized crime figures, Halloran approached FBI Special Agents Gerald Montanari and Leo Brunick with an explosive story. He claimed that Bulger and Flemmi had asked him to murder Roger Wheeler, and when he refused, they had someone else carry out the hit. Halloran's cooperation represented a potentially devastating threat to Bulger and Flemmi. For the first time, someone was willing to testify about their involvement in a high-profile murder. The FBI had to make a decision. Other FBI agents handling the case asked their supervisor, John Morris, for his assessment of Halloran's reliability. Morris faced a choice. He could tell the truth, that Halloran might indeed have valuable information and allow him to be placed in witness protection, potentially leading to the prosecution of Bulger and Flemmi. Or he could protect his corrupt relationship with the two gangsters. Morris chose corruption. He told the agents that Halloran was not a reliable source and could not be trusted. But Morris did something even worse. He told John Connolly that Halloran was cooperating with authorities and providing information about Bulger and Flemmi. Morris later testified that he fully expected this information would reach Bulger's ears. Robert Fitzpatrick, the assistant special agent in charge who'd been trying to get Halloran into witness protection, was horrified. He knew Halloran was in mortal danger. He approached Jeremiah O'Sullivan, head of the Federal Organized Crime Strike Force, requesting emergency placement of Halloran in the Witness Protection Program. O'Sullivan denied the request, saying Halloran wasn't worth protecting. Fitzpatrick went over O'Sullivan's head to William Weld, then the U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts. But Weld, who had political connections to Bulger's brother Billy, the powerful president of the Massachusetts State Senate, also rejected Halloran as a candidate for witness protection. Halloran was left exposed, walking around Boston with a target on his back, while the FBI and federal prosecutors who knew he was in danger did nothing to save him. On May 11, 1982, Brian Halloran spent the afternoon drinking at the Pier Restaurant on the South Boston waterfront, just blocks from what is now the federal courthouse. At some point that day, he called the FBI to check in with his handlers. He was told he could go home since there was no indication he was in immediate danger. That evening, Halloran was given a ride home by Michael Donahue, a 32-year-old father of three who worked as a truck driver. Donahue was completely innocent. He was simply doing a favor for an acquaintance. Neither man knew that Bulger was waiting for them in a 1975 Chevy Malibu, wearing a wig and fake mustache for disguise, with Kevin Weeks acting as his lookout. As Halloran and Donahue drove out of the restaurant parking lot, Bulger pulled up alongside them and opened fire with an automatic weapon. According to Kevin Weeks, who later testified about the murder, Bulger just kept shooting. Weeks described Halloran's bullet-riddled body as bouncing off the ground from the impact of the bullets. Both Halloran and Donahue died in the ambush. In the aftermath of the killings, FBI agents began investigating the Halloran-Donahue murders. They didn't know that Morris had leaked information about Halloran's cooperation to Connolly. Morris kept this information secret, even as his fellow agents worked to solve the murders. He later testified that he believed Bulger and Flemmi were responsible for the killings, but he hid his own role in setting them up. Morris's corruption continued throughout the 1980s. In 1988, he warned Bulger and Flemmi to stay away from John Bohorian, whose telephone was about to be tapped by the FBI. Morris told Connolly to relay the message not to do anything to Bohorian because he did not want another Halloran. The statement was an implicit admission that Morris understood his leak about Halloran had led to murder. He later repeated the warning directly to Bulger and Flemmi, telling them he could keep them out of any indictment arising from the Bohorian surveillance. True to his word, Bohorian and others were eventually indicted, but Flemmi was not. Morris admitted that he approved reports describing meetings with Bulger that never happened, or that described information Bulger supposedly provided when it actually came from other sources. Defense attorneys would later argue that Bulger wasn't actually an informant at all, because he was simply bribing corrupt FBI agents to protect him, and agents like Morris and Connolly were making up fake reports to cover up their corruption and make it look like they were running a productive informant. Throughout this relationship, Morris was still filled with guilt and anxiety. He was also worried that the relationship was becoming too obvious and that other law enforcement agencies were beginning to ask questions. Rather than confess to his superiors or to internal affairs investigators, he chose to leak the story to the Boston Globe. The Boston Globe published the story, revealing Bulger's status as an FBI informant. Bulger was furious. He called Morris and, according to Morris's later testimony, threatened him. Bulger reminded Morris about the case of wine, a reference to the $1,000 in an envelope stuffed into a wooden box, and said, "If I'm going to jail, you're going with me." The stress of Bulger's threat was so severe that Morris went into full cardiac arrest shortly after the phone call. He later testified, "I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out." Morris asked his FBI superiors if he could make a deal, but it would be nearly a decade before that deal would come into effect. The real break in the case came in 1994, when Bulger was tipped off by John Connolly that federal indictments were about to be issued against him and Stephen Flemmi. Bulger fled Boston and disappeared, beginning a 16-year period as one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives. Flemmi, who didn't flee fast enough, was arrested and charged with racketeering, extortion, murder, and illegal gambling. During pre-trial hearings in 1997, Flemmi claimed that he had been promised immunity from prosecution by his FBI handlers because of his status as a confidential informant. Flemmi testified that Morris, Connolly, and other FBI agents had told him and Bulger they could engage in any criminal activity short of murder without fear of prosecution. He also revealed the bribes he and Bulger had paid to FBI agents, including the $7,000 in cash and other gifts to Morris. Federal Judge Mark L. Wolf ordered extensive evidentiary hearings on Flemmi's claims. These hearings, which continued throughout 1998, would expose the full scope of FBI corruption in Boston. Witness after witness testified about how the FBI had protected Bulger and Flemmi for decades. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his corruption, Morris finally agreed to cooperate with authorities. In 1998, Morris was granted complete immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony. The immunity deal covered all of his criminal conduct, like the bribery, the obstruction of justice, his role in the Halloran Donahue murders, everything. In exchange, Morris would testify truthfully about FBI corruption and help prosecutors build cases against John Connolly and others. John Morris's immunity deal meant he would never face criminal trial for his own crimes. Instead, he would appear as a prosecution witness in multiple trials related to the Bulger corruption scandal. Morris first testified against Connolly in 2002, when his former subordinate and self-described best friend was tried on federal racketeering charges in Boston. Morris admitted on the stand that he had taken $7,000 in cash from Bulger, along with cases of wine, a plane ticket for his mistress, and other gifts. He confessed to approving false FBI reports, leaking information about investigations, and telling Connolly about Brian Halloran's cooperation, information he knew would reach Bulger. Despite the attacks on his credibility, Morris's testimony was deemed credible enough to help convict Connolly. In 2002, Connolly was convicted of racketeering, obstruction of justice, and lying to federal investigators. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. But prosecutors weren't done with Connolly. In 2005, he was indicted in Florida for the 1982 murder of John Callahan, a businessman who had been killed by John Martirano on Bulger's orders after Connolly warned them that Callahan was cooperating with investigators. Morris testified again, this time in a Miami courtroom in 2008, providing crucial evidence about the FBI's corrupt relationship with Bulger and Flemmi. The Florida jury convicted Connolly of second-degree murder in the Callahan killing. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison, a devastating blow for a man who had already served years on the federal conviction. Connolly would serve 19 years in prison before being released in 2021 due to medical issues related to cancer. Throughout his time in jail, Connolly maintained that Morris was more guilty than he was. Morris's most dramatic courtroom appearance came in June and July 2013, when he testified at the trial of James "Whitey" Bulger himself. After 16 years on the run, Bulger had been captured in Santa Monica, California in 2011, living with his girlfriend, Catherine Gregg. He was now 83 years old and facing federal racketeering indictment charging him with 19 murders, extortion, money laundering, and other crimes. When Morris took the stand on June 27, 2013, it was the first time he and Bulger had seen each other since 1991. Bulger glared at Morris throughout his testimony and at one point muttered, "Fucking liar," under his breath, prompting prosecutor Brian Kelly to ask Judge Denise Casper to warn the defendant. Then came the most dramatic moment of his testimony. On July 1, 2013, Morris turned to face the family of Michael Donahue, the innocent bystander killed alongside Halloran. With his eyes tearing up and his face reddening, Morris offered an apology. "I don't want to ask for your forgiveness, but I do want to express my sincere apology for things that I may have done and things that I didn't do. Not a day in my life has gone by that I haven't thought about this. Not a day in my life has gone by that I haven't prayed that God give you blessing and comfort for the pain that you have suffered. I am truly sorry." Patricia Donahue, Michael's widow, sat in the front row with her 3 sons, looking shaken. After court, she told reporters that Morris's apology didn't mean anything to her. "He should be in jail," she said. "He got away with murder, just like Whitey." On August 12, 2013, the jury convicted Bulger on 31 of 32 counts, including involvement in 11 murders. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences, plus 5 years. Morris had helped secure the conviction, but at the cost of publicly revealing the full extent of his own corruption to a national audience. Throughout the trial, the portrait of Morris that emerged was of a weak man who had betrayed his oath, his colleagues, and innocent victims to protect his career and avoid accountability. Because John Morris was granted immunity in 1998, he was never sentenced for his crimes. He faced no prison time, no probation, no community service. The only punishment he endured was public humiliation during his testimony, and the knowledge that he would be remembered as the sons, Michael Jr., Sean, and Tommy, alone. For decades, she lived with the cone of the most corrupt FBI agents in American history. The difference between how Morris and Connolly were treated raised questions. Both men were deeply corrupt. Both accepted bribes, leaked information, falsified reports, and enabled murders. In many ways, Morris was more guilty because he was Connolly's supervisor and had greater authority. Yet Connolly spent 19 years in prison, while Morris walked free with his full government pension. Federal Judge Mark L. Wolf, who presided over the 1998 hearings that exposed the corruption, documented that more than a dozen FBI agents, supervisors, and Justice Department officials had engaged in serious misconduct in their handling of Bulger and Flemmi. Morris was just one of many who should have faced consequences. The Justice Department, through Special Prosecutor John Durham, promised to investigate fully and hold all wrongdoers accountable. But in the end, only Connolly faced significant punishment. The rest, including Morris, escaped with at most administrative sanctions or early retirement. After retiring from the FBI in 1995, John Morris moved to Florida, far from the Boston streets. His immunity deal meant he kept his full government pension, funded by the same taxpayers whose trust he had betrayed. Morris was last known to be working as a wine consultant, a fitting occupation for the man nicknamed Vino by the gangsters who bribed him. Morris largely disappeared from public view after his dramatic testimony in the 2013 Bulger trial. Unlike some other public figures who seek rehabilitation through media appearances or memoir writing, Morris has maintained a low profile. He has not written a book about his experiences, given interviews to major media outlets, or attempted to rehabilitate his public image. He appears content to live out his remaining years in obscurity. The immunity deal that protected Morris remains controversial to this day. Legal scholars and crime writers have debated whether prosecutors made the right call in granting him such protection. The argument in favor is straightforward. Without Morris's testimony, it would have been much harder to convict John Connolly and document the full scope of FBI corruption. His testimony provided crucial insider details that no other witness could offer. In 2018, James Whitey Bulger was murdered in federal prison in West Virginia, beaten to death by fellow inmates shortly after his transfer there. John Connolly was finally released from prison in February 2021 after serving 19 years due to medical issues including cancer. He was 80 years old and in declining health. Upon his release, Connolly gave a brief interview in which he maintained that he had been unfairly used as a cover and that others, including Morris, had equal or greater responsibility for the corruption. Many observers, including Boston Globe columnist Kevin Cullen, agreed that Connolly had been made the FBI's fall guy. The legacy of John Morris is ultimately one of cowardice and moral failure. He was not a criminal like Bulger or a rogue like Connolly. He was someone who knew the difference between right and wrong, but consistently chose wrong when it served his interests. He accepted bribes, enabled murders, falsified official documents, and betrayed his oath, then saved himself by betraying everyone around him. The fact that he faces his final years as a free man, living comfortably on a government pension, while his victims remain dead and their families continue to grieve, stands as one of the most troubling outcomes in the history of federal law. Enforcement corruption. Before we continue, hit subscribe if you appreciate deep dives into stories that don't get the attention they deserve. While Morris traded testimony for freedom, this next story shows how an agent could be broken not by a gangster's threat, but by the Bureau's own action to protect its most valuable criminal asset. Robert Friedrich. In May 1986, the Federal Bureau of Investigation faced one of its most embarrassing scandals when Robert S. Friedrich, a decorated 13-year veteran and supervisor of the Cleveland Organized Crime Task Force, was indicted on 5 counts of making false statements to federal investigators. The charges alleged that Friedrich had lied under oath to protect Jackie Presser, the powerful president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, from prosecution in a massive payroll padding scheme involving over $700,000 in embezzled union funds. What made the scandal even more remarkable was the unprecedented show of support Friedrich received from approximately 60 of his fellow FBI agents, who traveled 9 hours from Cleveland to Washington, D.C., to applaud him as he entered the courthouse for his arraignment. The Friedrich case would expose deep tensions between the FBI and the Justice Department, raise serious questions about the handling of high-level informants, and establish an important legal precedent regarding compelled testimony that bears his name to this day, the Friedrich test. Robert S. Friedrich was born in 1944 and grew up to become what many considered a model law enforcement officer. Before joining the FBI, he served his country in the military during the Vietnam War era, earning decorations for his service. At age 29, Friedrich joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation, starting what would become a 13-year career in federal law enforcement. By the early 1980s, Friedrich had risen to a position of significant authority and responsibility within the FBI's Cleveland field office. As supervisor of the Organized Crime Task Force, he was at the front of one of the Bureau's most critical missions, investigating and prosecuting organized crime figures who had infiltrated legitimate businesses and labor unions. This role placed him in direct contact with some of the most dangerous criminals operating in the Midwest, particularly those associated with the Cleveland mob and their connections to the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Friedrich was known among his colleagues as a dedicated agent who had earned multiple commendations from FBI Director William Webster himself. His personnel file documented outstanding service, and he was respected within the Cleveland office for his work on organized crime cases. By 1986, at age 42, He was married with 5 children and living in suburban Lakewood, Ohio. His family life appeared stable, and he was regarded as a responsible father and husband. The position Friedrich held required him to navigate the complex world of criminal informants, a necessary but often morally troublesome aspect of organized crime investigations. Supervisors of organized crime task forces regularly dealt with individuals who lived double lives. Criminals who provided information to the FBI in exchange for money, protection, or leniency. Managing these relationships required judgment, discretion, and strict adherence to FBI protocols about what activities could and could not be authorized for informants to take part in, while maintaining their criminal covers. It was in this capacity that Friedrich became the FBI handler for one of the Bureau's most valuable and controversial informants, Jackie Presser, who would eventually rise to become president of the Teamsters Union while serving as a top-tier FBI informant codenamed Alpro at the same time. The relationship between the FBI and Jackie Presser began in the early 1970s, years before Friedrich became his handler. Presser, the son of convicted labor racketeer William Big Bill Presser, had followed his father into the Teamsters organization and had extensive connections to organized crime figures in Cleveland, Chicago, and on the East Coast. After an embarrassing incident involving the IRS in 1972, Presser agreed to become an FBI informant, receiving $2,500 per month for providing information about mob activities within the Teamsters. Presser was marked as one of the FBI's most prized sources. He provided crucial intelligence about organized crime's infiltration of the labor movement and helped the FBI build cases against other corrupt union officials and mob figures. In fact, Presser's cooperation provided the FBI with information that proved crucial to the indictment and conviction of the previous Teamsters president, Roy L. Williams, who was convicted in December 1982 of conspiring to bribe a U.S. senator. By the early 1980s, Robert Friedrich had become one of the primary FBI agents handling Presser's information. As supervisor of the Cleveland Organized Crime Task Force, Friedrich was responsible for maintaining the relationship with this high-value informant and ensuring that Presser's intelligence was properly documented and shared with appropriate authorities. However, there was a significant problem brewing beneath the surface. Beginning around 1974, according to court records, Presser had allegedly begun filling the payroll at Teamsters Local 507 in Cleveland with ghost employees, individuals who received paychecks but performed no actual work for the union. These ghost workers included Presser's uncle and others, and the scheme eventually involved approximately $700,000 in fraudulent union funds. The money was allegedly being funneled to other Teamsters officials and members of the Cleveland mob. In 1981, the U.S. Department of Labor began investigating the payroll allegations at Local 507. Labor Department investigators, working independently of the FBI, uncovered evidence of the fraud. By 1984, attorneys with the U.S. Department of Justice were seeking approval to prosecute Presser based on the Labor Department's reports. This created an extraordinarily delicate situation for the FBI. Presser was a valuable informant, providing intelligence on organized crime, and was now a target of a major federal fraud investigation. The FBI's Cleveland office, where Friedrich worked, had to balance these competing interests while also navigating increasingly tense relationships with both the Justice Department's Organized Crime Strike Force and Labor Department investigators. The tension escalated in June 1984 when the Los Angeles Times published a story naming Presser as a U.S. government criminal informant, quoting unnamed FBI official. This was the first time that government leaders had confirmed what had long been rumored. The publicity put Presser in potential danger from mob figures who might view him as a traitor, and it also placed intense scrutiny on how the FBI was handling their relationship with him. During this period, according to later indictments and testimony, Friedrich and other Cleveland FBI agents held meetings with Presser and discussed strategies for handling the payroll padding investigation. The FBI agents allegedly told their Justice Department superiors that they had authorized Presser to place ghost employees on the union payroll as part of maintaining his cover as an informant and to prevent war between competing organized crime groups in Cleveland. Under certain circumstances, federal officials are permitted to authorize illegal activities by government informants if necessary to protect lives or maintain a significant investigation. When Friedrich and other agents claimed they had given Presser such authorization, it placed Justice Department prosecutors in an extremely difficult position. In the summer of 1985, based largely on the statements from Friedrich and other Cleveland FBI agents, the Justice Department made the decision to suspend its attempt to indict Presser. The case against one of the most powerful labor leaders in America appeared to be dead. The crime that Robert Friedrich was ultimately charged with was not the embezzlement scheme itself, but rather lying to federal investigators about his role in protecting Jackie Presser from prosecution. The charges centered on statements Friedrich made during internal FBI and Justice Department investigations in the summer of 1985. According to the May 15, 1986 federal indictment, Friedrich was charged with 5 counts of making false statements under oath to government prosecutors and FBI officials. Specifically, the indictment alleged that, first, Friedrich had falsely claimed that he and other FBI agents had authorized Jackie Presser to engage in the payroll padding scheme at Teamsters Local 507. Second, he hid information about meetings he had held with Presser and others to discuss strategies for avoiding Presser's indictment. Third, he lied about the nature and extent of his communications with Presser regarding the ghost employee scheme. Fourth, he made false statements designed to derail the ongoing Labor Department investigation into Presser. And lastly, he provided misleading information that caused the Justice Department to temporarily abandon its prosecution of Presser. The investigation that led to Friedrich's indictment began when Justice Department officials grew increasingly skeptical of the authorization claims made by Cleveland FBI agents. An internal Justice Department review was started, and investigators began questioning whether Friedrich and other agents had actually received proper authorization from FBI headquarters to let Presser engage in the payroll scheme. In January 1986, Friedrich was called in for additional questioning. What happened during these interrogations would later become a legal issue. Friedrich was presented with Form 645, a standard FBI document that indicated he was required to provide information to the internal investigation, and that refusal could result in sanctions, including possible dismissal from the Bureau. Under what he believed was compulsion, facing the loss of his job if he refused to cooperate, Friedrich admitted under oath that his earlier statements had been false. He acknowledged that he had not actually received proper authorization from FBI superiors to allow Presser to engage in the payroll scheme. The interrogations continued over 4 days. During this time, according to court records, investigators went back over the information about which Friedrich had given false statements, asking him for details. Friedrich was not informed of his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination during most of these sessions. He was told the purpose of the interviews was to determine his usefulness as a grand jury witness, but investigators provided vague and ambiguous answers when Friedrich asked for clarification about his status. Only on the 4th day of questioning was Friedrich finally told that he could remain silent if he chose. By that point, however, he had already made multiple admissions about having lied to protect Presser. Further investigation suggested that Presser may have informed FBI agents that he intended to appoint mob figures as his top union lieutenants, but this information was never passed on to senior-level administrators at FBI headquarters. On May 15, 1986, 2 separate federal grand juries handed down indictments. In Cleveland, Jackie Presser and 2 associates, Teamsters Vice President Harold Friedman and local union official Anthony Hughes, were indicted on charges of embezzling more than $700,000 through the ghost employee scheme. At the same time in Washington, D.C., Robert Friedrich was indicted on 5 counts of making false statements to federal investigators. The indictment marked Friedrich as the 13th FBI agent to be either indicted or convicted since 1978, highlighting growing concerns about corruption within the Bureau during that era. The Cleveland grand jury focused initially on the payroll scheme, but expanded its investigation after discovering evidence that FBI agents had failed to tell their supervisors about authorizing Presser's criminal activities. The grand jury found that FBI and Justice Department officials had illegally withheld information about Presser's role from defense attorneys in previous cases, potentially affecting other prosecutions. The Washington, D.C. grand jury, which began its investigation in April 1986, specifically investigated whether FBI agents had made false statements to supervisors about their relationship with Presser. This investigation built on information uncovered by the Cleveland proceedings and examined the entire chain of command involved in handling the Presser-informant relationship. Senate hearings conducted by the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations examined whether political considerations had influenced the handling of the Presser case. Presser had been one of the few major labor leaders to endorse Ronald Reagan in the 1980 and 1984 elections, and had served on Reagan's transition team. However, the Senate report ultimately concluded there was no evidence to support allegations of political influence in the decision to initially drop charges against Presser. On August 22, 1986, FBI Director William Webster made the decision to fire Friedrich. The FBI's official statement said the dismissal came after serious deliberation and careful consideration of the facts, but noted that because of privacy considerations, these same facts cannot be made available to the public. Law enforcement sources told reporters that Friedrich was fired not only for the issues in his criminal indictment, but also for taking files on FBI informants from the Cleveland office without authorization. The investigation continued beyond Friedrich's indictment. The Washington grand jury remained active, and Justice Department officials indicated they were investigating whether other FBI agents in Cleveland might also face charges for their roles in the Presser case. Robert Friedrich's trial was scheduled to begin on December 2, 1986, in the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., before Judge George H. Revercombe. However, the proceedings would take an unexpected turn. William Byer, Friedrich's attorney, filed a motion to suppress the statements his client had made during the January 1986 interrogations. Byer argued that these statements had been obtained in violation of Friedrich's Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. The argument centered on the fact that Friedrich had been presented with Form 645, which specifically stated that refusal to answer questions could result in disciplinary action, including dismissal, and that he had therefore been compelled to incriminate himself under threat of losing his job. On December 4, 1986, just before trial was set to begin, Judge Revercombe issued a stunning ruling that effectively destroyed the government's case. The judge concluded that Friedrich's statements to investigators were inadmissible on Fifth Amendment grounds because they had been compelled under circumstances where Friedrich reasonably believed he would lose his job if he refused to cooperate. Judge Revercombe's ruling established what would become known as the Friedrich test, or subjective objective test, for determining whether testimony has been compelled. The test asks two questions. 1. Did the employee have a subjective belief that they were subject to dismissal if they refused to answer questions? And 2. Was this subjective belief objectively reasonable? The ruling meant that all of Friedrich's admissions from the January 1986 interrogation could not be used against him at trial. Without Friedrich's own statements acknowledging that he had lied, prosecutors would have difficulty proving the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. The government attempted to proceed with the remaining evidence, but the loss of Friedrich's compelled statements damaged the case completely. Eventually, the charges against Friedrich were dismissed when it became clear the government could not obtain a conviction without the inadmissible testimony. While Friedrich's criminal charges were dismissed, his legal troubles were far from over. In December 1988, nearly 2 years after the dismissal, Friedrich was called to testify under a grant of immunity in the prosecution of Presser's associates, Harold Friedman and Anthony Hughes, who were being tried for embezzlement in connection with the payroll scheme. Jackie Presser himself had died in July 1988 without ever going to trial, as his cancer and heart disease caused repeated delays. When Friedrich refused to testify even under immunity, he was held in contempt of court by U.S. District Judge George White. On December 2nd, 1988, Friedrich was released on $1,000 personal bond. But on December 5th, Judge White revoked the bond and sent Friedrich to Cuyahoga County Jail. The contempt proceedings did not result in a specific sentence, but rather involved confinement in Cuyahoga County Jail. The purpose was not punishment, but rather to compel Friedrich's cooperation with the ongoing prosecution. The government indicated it might seek delays in the trial to determine whether spending time in jail would change Friedrich's mind about testifying. The case represented a betrayal of the public trust. Federal law enforcement agencies are tasked with investigating and prosecuting criminal activity without fear or favor. When an FBI supervisor allegedly lies to protect a criminal informant from prosecution, it affects the integrity of the entire justice system. Within the FBI itself, there was a sense of institutional damage. While 60 agents had shown support for Friedrich at his arraignment, believing in his innocence, or at least his right to a fair hearing, his firing raised questions about oversight of informant relationships and whether the Bureau had become too protective of high-value sources at the expense of supporting legitimate prosecutions by other agencies. The case also exposed victims among other law enforcement professionals. The two Labor Department investigators who had worked on the Presser case found themselves being investigated by the FBI, creating a hostile environment for interagency cooperation. This potentially allowed other criminals to escape accountability when different federal agencies failed to work together effectively. For Friedrich personally, even without a criminal conviction, the consequences were severe. He lost his career in the FBI, where he had served with distinction for 13 years and received multiple commendations. His reputation was permanently stained, regardless of the dismissal of charges. The Robert Friedrich case left a lasting impact legally, especially on federal law enforcement practices, even though Friedrich himself was never convicted of the charges against him. Most importantly, the Friedrich test, established by Judge Revercom's ruling, remains an important precedent in cases involving compelled testimony from government employees. The subjective-objective standard for determining whether statements were coerced has been cited in numerous cases that followed and adopted by multiple federal circuit courts. This legal legacy ensures that government employees cannot be forced to incriminate themselves under threat of job loss, and then have those compelled statements used against them in criminal proceedings. The Teamsters investigation continued after Friedrich's charges were dismissed. The case against Jackie Presser became moot when he died on July 9, 1988, at age 61, from cardiac arrest following a long battle with brain cancer and heart disease. His associates, Harold Friedman and Anthony Hughes, proceeded to trial, though the outcome of that prosecution was complicated by Friedrich's refusal to testify. The events that happened later contributed to larger federal efforts to eliminate organized crime influence from the Teamsters Union. In 1989, the U.S. government filed a civil RICO lawsuit seeking to place the Teamsters under federal trusteeship. This ultimately resulted in the 1989 consent decree that reformed union election procedures and led to the eventual weakening of mob control over the organization. For the FBI, the Friedrich case prompted soul-searching about how the Bureau managed high-level informants and coordinated with other law enforcement agencies. The tensions between the FBI's desire to protect valuable intelligence sources and the Justice Department's responsibility to prosecute criminal conduct had been exposed in a very public way. These institutional conflicts would require ongoing attention to prevent similar situations in the future. As for Robert Friedrich himself, public records about his life after the legal proceedings are scarce. He faded from public view following his contempt citation and jail time in 1988. Whether he found other employment, how his family handled the scandal, and where he ultimately settled remain largely unknown. The extensive news coverage that accompanied his indictment and trial gave way to silence about his post-FBI existence. The case has become a story about the dangers of noble cause corruption, or the event where law enforcement officers justify unethical or illegal behavior because they believe it serves a greater good. Friedrich's apparent belief that protecting Jackie Presser as a valuable informant justified lying to investigators represented a misunderstanding of law enforcement ethics. no informant, regardless of how valuable, should be placed above the law. The Friedrich case remains a significant chapter in the history of FBI controversies and continues to be studied in law enforcement ethics training and in legal education regarding Fifth Amendment protections for compelled testimony. Before we move on to the next case, make sure to subscribe if you're finding these stories as disturbing as I am. It helps us keep covering the stories that most channels won't touch. While Friedrich's case was about protecting a single informant, Nick Gianturco. In the long history of corruption in the FBI, few names are as troubling yet as overlooked as Nicholas "Nick" Gianturco, known to his underworld benefactors as Doc. While his colleague John Connolly would eventually be convicted of murder and racketeering, and Supervisor John Morris would receive immunity in exchange for testimony. Gianturco, who by multiple accounts accepted thousands of dollars in cash payoffs from Boston's most notorious gangsters, never faced a single criminal charge. Instead, he quietly took it on the lam, as Boston Herald columnist Howie Carr put it, retiring from the FBI and fading into obscurity, while the corruption scandal he helped enable destroyed lives, resulted in wrongful convictions, and allowed murderers to operate with impunity for decades. Gianturco's story represents perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the Whitey Bulger scandal: the agents who weren't held accountable. As the FBI informant coordinator in Boston during the 1980s and early 1990s, Gianturco occupied a crucial position of trust. He was responsible for overseeing the Bureau's relationships with confidential sources, ensuring they were properly managed, that their intelligence was accurately reported, and that they weren't being allowed to commit crimes under the FBI's protection. Instead, according to testimony from mobster Stephen "the Rifleman" Flemmi, Gianturco was on the Winter Hill Gang's payroll, accepting cash bribes while entertaining the very criminals he was supposed to be investigating in his own home. The image of Gianturco hosting Whitey Bulger and Stephen Flemmi for dinner, serving them wine at his residence, while they brought expensive crystal stemware because they didn't like his cheap grocery store wine glasses, captures the stunning reversal of roles that almost became normalized in the Boston FBI office during that era. These law enforcement officials were now friends and socializing with serial killers, accepting their gifts and protecting them from the consequences of their crimes. And while Connolly ultimately paid a price, Gianturco never did. Nicholas Gianturco joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation during an era when the Bureau was laser-focused on dismantling La Cosa Nostra, the Italian-American mafia that had dominated organized crime in America for decades. By the late 1970s, Gianturco had established himself as a capable agent working undercover operations, including dangerous assignments infiltrating truck hijacking rings. His undercover alias was Nick Giaro, and he was known among colleagues as competent and dedicated to the work. Gianturco's path to corruption began through his friendship with fellow FBI agent John Connolly, who had grown up in South Boston's Old Harbor housing project, just doors away from the Bulger family. Connolly, who was charismatic and well-connected, had convinced his supervisors to allow him to recruit his childhood neighbor, James "Whitey" Bulger, as a top-echelon FBI informant in 1975. The logic was simple. Bulger, who led the Irish Winter Hill Gang, could provide intelligence on the Italian mafia, specifically the Patriarca crime family that controlled much of New England's organized crime. What made this relationship particularly valuable to the FBI was that Bulger's partner, Stephen "the Rifleman" Flemmi, had already been an FBI informant since the 1960s, working with another FBI agent, H. Paul Rico. Flemmi had served 2 tours in Korea, earned the Silver Star and Bronze Star, and then returned home to become one of Boston's most feared contract killers. Despite his homicidal tendencies, Flemmi's connections to both the Irish Winter Hill Gang and the Italian Patriarca family made him extraordinarily valuable to the FBI. Gianturco became involved in managing these informants through his work with Connolly on the FBI's Organized Crime Squad. The exact timeline of when Gianturco began accepting gifts and payments from Bulger and Flemmi is not entirely clear from public records, but by the early 1980s, he had developed what he would later characterize as a friendship with the two gangsters. Unlike Connolly, who was the primary handler for Bulger and Flemmi, Gianturco's role was as informant coordinator, a supervisory position that gave him oversight of the FBI's entire stable of confidential sources in the Boston area. Gianturco's nickname among the gangsters, Doc, implied that Gianturco was someone who could be relied upon to fix problems, to provide the medicine, information, and protection that kept the Winter Hill Gang healthy and thriving. The corruption of Nick Gianturco didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual process of moral compromise that began with small gestures and escalated to what prosecutors and witnesses would later describe as systematic bribery. According to court testimony and accounts in investigative books like Black Mass by Dick Lair and Gerard O'Neill, the relationship between Gianturco and the gangsters deepened in the late 1970s. Connolly, who was orchestrating these social interactions, convinced Gianturco and supervisor John Morris that their relationships with Bulger and Flemmi were different from typical informant relationships. They referred to Bulger and Flemmi as valuable partners in the war against La Cosa Nostra, who deserved special respect. Gianturco bought into this logic. He began inviting Bulger and Flemmi to his home in Peabody for dinner about 5 times. The gangsters would arrive bearing wine. Good wine. Expensive wine. During the second dinner, Bulger noticed that Gianturco was serving the wine in cheap grocery store glasses, so he brought an expensive crystal stemware set as a gift. Gianturco accepted it. The gift-giving became reciprocal and routine. According to Flemmi's later testimony, Gianturco and other FBI agents exchanged presents with the gangsters at Christmas. During a trip to San Francisco, Gianturco spotted a belt buckle with an engraving of Alcatraz and thought of Whitey Bulger. He bought it and gave it to Connolly to pass along to Bulger, who began wearing it regularly. Flemmi recalled receiving a sweatshirt from Nick Gianturco. The agents and the gangsters also exchanged books. At Christmas gatherings, Bulger and Flemmi gave Gianturco an attaché case and an oriental figurine, items carefully selected because the gangsters had noticed during their dinners at his home that Gianturco's wife collected such statuettes. These weren't just random gifts. They were tokens of an intimate relationship built on careful observation and mutual affection. But according to Stephen Flemmi's testimony in multiple federal trials, the gift-giving went far beyond crystal stemware and belt buckles. Flemmi testified that he and Bulger paid off between 5 and 7 Boston FBI agents, including John Connolly, John Morris, Nick Gianturco, Michael Buckley, and John Agent Orange Newton. They were cash payoffs ranging from $2,500 to $5,000 at a time, funded from an expense account that Bulger had established specifically for corrupting law enforcement. Flemmi specifically testified that Nick Gianturco received thousands in cash payoffs from the Winter Hill Gang. The gangsters referred to this corruption fund using Whitey Bulger's motto, "Christmas is for cops and kids." Federal agents, in Bulger's worldview, wanted more dirty money than everyone else. The explanation that allowed Gianturco to accept these gifts and payments was built on a foundation Connolly had carefully constructed, that Bulger had saved Gianturco's life. In October 1978, Gianturco was working undercover in a truck hijacking case when, late one night, Connolly called him and told him not to attend a planned meeting with the hijackers. According to Connolly, Bulger had tipped him off that the hijackers were planning to kill Nick Giaro, which was Gianturco's undercover alias. Gianturco testified that Connolly told him, "They were going to kill me." Grateful for the warning, Gianturco later stated, "I was kind of glad that Mr. Bulger and Mr. Flemmi were kind of watching out for me." This belief that the gangsters had saved his life created a sense of personal obligation that Connolly took advantage of to deepen Gianturco's corruption. However, the life-saving narrative was almost certainly exaggerated or made up. As documented by the Boston Globe's Spotlight team, Connolly filed no report documenting this supposedly critical intelligence at the time it occurred. FBI agents are required to file 209-insert reports, documenting fresh intelligence from informants. Yet, with an agent's life supposedly hanging in the balance, Connolly wrote nothing. He only began citing these life-saving moments years later, in 1980, when he was trying to justify continued use of Bulger and Flemmi as informants, despite growing concerns about their criminal activities. By the mid-1980s, Gianturco had become so comfortable with Bulger and Flemmi that he later testified he felt comfortable having them in the house. The distance between law enforcement and organized crime had completely collapsed. Nick Gianturco's corruption was particularly damaging because of his role as informant coordinator for the Boston FBI office. This wasn't a line agent handling a single source. This was a supervisor responsible for oversight of the entire confidential informant program, one of the FBI's most critical and sensitive operations. The informant coordinator's job was to ensure that agents were following proper procedures, documenting their meetings with sources, accurately reporting intelligence, not allowing informants to commit crimes, and maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. Gianturco was supposed to be the safeguard against exactly the type of corruption he was engaging in. In 1994, when the FBI's relationship with Bulger began facing external investigation, federal prosecutors Wayne Budd, John Pappalardo, and Paul Ullman went to the FBI to confirm what the Boston Globe had first reported in 1988, that Whitey Bulger was an FBI informant. They sat down with FBI Special Agent in Charge Tom Hughes, his assistant Dennis O'Callahan, and informant coordinator Nick Gianturco. When the federal prosecutors representing the U.S. Department of Justice asked whether Bulger was an informant, the FBI agents refused to tell them. As the Boston Globe reported, the FBI told them to go pound sand. They wouldn't tell them squat. This stunning refusal to cooperate with federal prosecutors demonstrated the depth of the protective wall that corrupted FBI agents had built around Bulger. Gianturco's role in this obstruction was particularly significant. As informant coordinator, he had access to all the documentation about Bulger's status. He knew the truth. Yet he participated in hiding information from the very prosecutors who were trying to investigate organized crime in Boston. The prosecutors were forced to appeal directly to FBI headquarters to get around Bulger's protectors in Boston. This incident revealed how Gianturco's corruption had compromised the FBI's core mission. The Bureau exists to support federal law enforcement efforts, not to obstruct them. Yet here was the informant coordinator actively preventing prosecutors from accessing information they needed to do their jobs, all to protect a serial killer who was paying him bribes. Gianturco's friendship with Connolly made him particularly invested in protecting Bulger. As one passage from Black Mass notes, Nick Gianturco, for one, was enamored of Connolly. This personal loyalty to Connolly appears to have blinded Gianturco to his professional obligations. When cases against Bulger and Flemmi mysteriously disappeared or stalled, Gianturco, as informant coordinator, was in a position to understand what was happening and to intervene. Instead, he appears to have been part of the problem. The 1976 extortion case against Bulger involving restaurateur Francis X. Green went nowhere. The 1983 extortion of Stephen and Julie Rakes, who were forced to sell their liquor store to Bulger, was never investigated, despite their complaint to the FBI. Multiple potential prosecutions simply vanished because FBI agents chose not to pursue them. As informant coordinator, Gianturco should have been asking questions. Instead, he was part of the corrupt system that allowed these abuses to continue. The Boston FBI's corruption began to unravel in the late 1980s and early 1990s through the work of investigators who refused to accept the Bureau's explanations for why certain criminals seemed untouchable. The Boston Globe's Spotlight team, led by reporters Dick Lair and Gerard O'Neill, published explosive stories in 1988, revealing that Whitey Bulger was an FBI informant. This was the first time the public learned that the FBI had been protecting one of Boston's most dangerous criminals. The revelations prompted outrage and raised serious questions about what the FBI had allowed Bulger to do while he was under their protection. In 1994, federal prosecutors finally secured indictments against both Bulger and Flemmi on racketeering charges. However, in a devastating blow to the case, someone tipped off the gangsters about the pending indictments. On December 23, 1994, John Connolly, who had retired from the FBI 4 years earlier, visited the Winter Hill Gang's headquarters at the South Boston Liquor Mart and warned Bulger and Flemmi that they were about to be arrested. According to testimony from Kevin Weeks, Bulger's lieutenant, Weeks immediately passed this information to Bulger, prompting the crime boss to flee that same day. Bulger would remain on the run for more than 16 years, making the FBI's 10 most wanted list alongside Osama bin Laden, before finally being captured in Santa Monica, California in 2011. Flemmi stayed in the Boston area and was arrested on January 5, 1995. His capture and eventual cooperation would prove devastating to the corrupt FBI agents who had protected him, including revelations about Nick Gianturco. As federal investigators dug deeper into the FBI's relationship with Bulger and Flemmi, the full scope of the corruption emerged. In 1998, U.S. District Judge Mark Wolf conducted extensive hearings exploring the FBI's controversial relationship with the gangsters. His findings documented a pattern of systemic corruption that went far beyond just John Connolly. Multiple FBI agents had accepted bribes, protected the gangsters from prosecution, provided them with intelligence about investigations and informants, who were murdered after, and created false documentation to cover their tracks. Stephen Flemmi, facing life in prison, or possibly the death penalty, decided to cooperate with prosecutors. In testimony across multiple trials, Flemmi provided detailed accounts of the cash payoffs he and Bulger had made to FBI agents. According to Kevin Weeks, who also cooperated, Flemmi identified the agents who received payments as including James Ring, John Morris, Nicholas Gianturco, and John Newton. Flemmi was particularly specific about the amounts. Connolly received approximately $235,000 over the years, with one payment of $50,000 coming from a drug shipment, after which Connolly joked, "I'm one of the gang now." Other agents received payments ranging from $2,500 to $5,000 at a time from Bulger's FBI expense fund. When Flemmi testified that Gianturco was one of a half-dozen Boston FBI agents who took cash payoffs from the Winter Hill Gang, it was a direct accusation of federal bribery, one of the most serious crimes a law enforcement officer can commit. However, Gianturco was never charged. Unlike Connolly, who was indicted in December 1999, or Morris, who received immunity in exchange for testimony, Gianturco faced no legal consequences. The reasons for this remain somewhat unclear, but likely involve a combination of factors: the strength of available evidence, the credibility of witnesses — Flemmi was a confessed serial killer — and prosecutorial decisions about which cases to pursue. Nick Gianturco was called to testify as a defense witness during John Connolly's murder trial in Miami. Connolly was being prosecuted for his role in the 1982 murder of businessman John Callahan, whom Bulger had killed after Connolly told the gangsters that Callahan might cooperate with investigators. Connolly's defense team called Gianturco and other retired FBI agents to testify that Bulger and Flemmi had been valuable informants who provided critical intelligence against the mafia, the implication being that any protection Connolly provided was justified by the results they achieved. Taking the stand, the retired Gianturco portrayed his relationship with the gangsters in the most benign possible terms. He described inviting Bulger and Flemmi to his home for dinner about 5 times, acknowledging that they brought wine, and that during the second meal, he accepted expensive crystal stemware from Bulger. He admitted exchanging gifts with the gangsters at Christmas, receiving an attaché case and an oriental figurine. When asked what he gave in return, Gianturco conveniently couldn't recall. He testified about giving Bulger the Alcatraz belt buckle and acknowledged arranging for the gangsters to attend a dinner with high-profile former New York FBI agents. He explained that he had become friendly with them after Connolly told him Bulger had saved his life by warning about the hijackers' murder plot. Asked about gift-giving and socializing, Gianturco admitted, At the time, it did not dawn on me that it was something that I probably should not have done. This was a stunning admission. An experienced FBI agent, serving as informant coordinator, claimed he didn't realize that accepting expensive gifts from and socializing with violent criminals violated FBI regulations. Then came the critical moment. Flemmi had testified that Gianturco was one of a half-dozen Boston FBI agents who took cash payoffs from the Winter Hill Gang. Under oath, Gianturco denied the allegation. This denial was exactly what Connolly's defense team hoped for. If Gianturco was lying about taking bribes, perhaps Flemmi was lying about everything else, including Connolly's role in murders. The defense strategy was to create doubt about Flemmi's credibility by getting witnesses to contradict his testimony. However, prosecutor Fred Wyshak subjected Gianturco to what was described as a grueling, hours-long cross-examination. By the time Wyshak was finished, it was clear that even if Gianturco hadn't taken cash bribes, Bulger and Flemmi had been far more than just informants, as they had been trusted members of the FBI inner circle, as the Hartford Courant reported, rather than criminals whose gang was believed responsible for more than 50 murders. Despite Gianturco's denial of taking cash payoffs, his testimony ultimately didn't help Connolly's defense. The jury convicted Connolly of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Nick Gianturco was never indicted for his involvement with the Winter Hill Gang. Unlike John Connolly, who would spend years in prison for racketeering and murder, or John Morris, who had to trade testimony for immunity, Gianturco simply retired from the FBI and disappeared from public view. As Boston Herald columnist Howie Carr noted, some of the mob's dearest FBI pals, like H. Paul Rico, Dennis Condon, and Dennis O'Callahan, were dead by the time the scandal fully emerged. Others, such as John Morris, Nick Gianturco, and Agent Orange Newton, wisely took it on the lam. The phrase, "took it on the lam," typically refers to criminals fleeing justice. These agents didn't face criminal prosecution, but they recognized that public investigation of their actions during the Bulger years would be devastating to their reputations. Rather than defend themselves publicly, they retreated into silence. Gianturco's post-FBI career became the same as that of his corrupt colleague Connolly. Just as Connolly had become director of security for Boston Edison after retiring in 1990, a position arranged by former FBI agent John Kehoe, Gianturco also became director of security for Boston Edison. It was a landing spot for former FBI agents, regardless of how questionable their conduct had been during their bureau careers. Gianturco was so close to Connolly that he served as master of ceremonies for Connolly's 1990 farewell dinner from the FBI. According to Howie Carr, Gianturco was so crooked that he was the master of ceremonies for the 1990 farewell dinner for John Zip Connolly, one of the Boston FBI agents who moonlighted as a hitman for the mob. The lack of prosecution for Gianturco and other implicated agents represented a significant failure of accountability. While the evidence against Connolly was overwhelming, and he had directly facilitated murders by tipping off Bulger about informants and investigations, the evidence against Gianturco was more circumstantial. Primarily the testimony of confessed murderer Stephen Flemmi, whose credibility could be attacked. Additionally, the statute of limitations may have protected Gianturco. Many of the alleged bribes occurred in the 1980s and early 1990s, and by the time the full scope of the corruption was revealed in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it may have been too late to prosecute some charges. Still, the lack of accountability left a bitter taste for many who followed the scandal. 4 innocent men, Joseph Salvati, Peter Lamone, Louis Greco, and Henry Tamelio, were framed for a 1965 murder they didn't commit because FBI agents, including Agent Paul Rico, knowingly withheld evidence that would have helped them. The men spent 3 decades in prison for crimes they didn't commit, with 2 dying behind bars. In 2007, the federal government paid $101.7 million to the families of these wrongfully convicted men, one of the largest civil rights settlements in U.S. history. When Mike Albano, who had served on the Massachusetts Parole Board, tried to help these framed men in the 1990s, he was paid a visit by John Connolly and John Morris and told to back off. Later, when Albano became mayor of Springfield, the FBI investigated him, but never brought charges. Unlike many of the other corrupt FBI agents involved in the Whitey Bulger scandal, Nick Gianturco's later life remains largely mysterious. After his appearance at John Connolly's 2008 trial in Miami, he seems to have successfully faded into obscurity. What is known is that Gianturco retired from the FBI and took a lucrative position at Boston Edison, following in the footsteps of John Connolly. Beyond that, public records about his life are scarce. He did not write a memoir, did not give media interviews, and appears to have successfully avoided the spotlight that followed other figures in the scandal. Gianturco's brother, Charlie Gianturco, was also an FBI agent, and according to Howie Carr, when Stephen Flemmi was arrested in 1995, Charlie was the first FBI agent Stevie Flemmi demanded to see. The message was clear. The FBI put someone with family ties to a corrupt agent in charge of finding Bulger, guaranteeing the search would not be as hard as it should be. The legacy of the Boston FBI's corruption extends far beyond the agents who participated in it. The scandal revealed how the FBI's informant program could be corrupted when agents developed personal relationships with sources and lost sight of their mission. The special respect that Connolly insisted Bulger and Flemmi deserved became a justification for abandoning professional ethics and legal obligations. The Whitey Bulger case led to significant reforms in how the FBI manages confidential informants. The Bureau implemented stricter oversight, better documentation requirements, and clearer prohibitions on agents socializing with sources or accepting gifts. The role of informant coordinator, the position Gianturco abused, received particular scrutiny and enhanced oversight procedures. Nick Gianturco embodies the FBI agents who enabled the Bulger catastrophe, but avoided legal consequences. He wasn't the mastermind like Connolly, or the supervisor who accepted cash bribes like Morris. He was the informant coordinator who looked the other way, who accepted the gifts, who felt comfortable having murderers to his house for dinner, and who participated in obstructing justice when prosecutors tried to investigate. His escape from prosecution represents one of the enduring frustrations of the Bulger scandal. While Connolly sits in prison, he was released on medical parole in 2021 after serving most of his sentence. And while the families of wrongfully convicted men received their settlement money, and while victims' families finally saw some measure of justice, Nick Gianturco faced no legal reckoning. Stephen Flemmi testified repeatedly that Gianturco took thousands in bribes. Kevin Weeks corroborated the culture of FBI corruption. The documentary evidence showed Gianturco violating FBI regulations by socializing with informants and accepting gifts. Yet no grand jury indicted him. No trial subjected his conduct to scrutiny. And no judge sentenced him for his betrayal of his oath. Today, if Nick Gianturco is still alive, he would be in his 80s or 90s. Whether he lives with the guilt of what he enabled, the murders that could have been prevented, the innocent people who were framed, the justice that was denied, is known only to him. But his story serves as a reminder that in the criminal justice system, the most frustrating corruption is not always the kind that results in dramatic trials and prison sentences. Sometimes it's the quiet corruption, the unprosecuted betrayals, the agents who took it on the lam and got away. The Boston FBI office's corruption wasn't just about one rogue agent. It was systemic, involving multiple agents across years. And while John Connolly became the face of that corruption and paid the price, Nick Gianturco, who by all accounts was part of the same corrupt system, simply walked away. Make sure to subscribe before the next story. Trust me, it's even more shocking than what you just heard. Gianturco was a corrupt agent who escaped justice, but this next one got caught because his greed led him to trade national security for expensive gifts and drug-filled parties. Babak Brumand. On April 24, 2020, federal agents surrounded a home in Lafayette, California to arrest one of their own. Babak Brumond, a 53-year-old former FBI supervisory special agent with nearly 2 decades of distinguished service in national security investigations, was taken into custody on charges that would shock the law enforcement community. The Iranian immigrant, who had once told colleagues he joined the FBI because his family wouldn't let him join the military, now stood accused of selling America's secrets to the very criminals he was sworn to fight, Armenian organized crime figures, who had recognized his weakness for luxury and exploited it ruthlessly. Federal prosecutors alleged that from January 2015 through December 2018, Brumond had accepted at least $150,000 in cash bribes, plus a $36,000 Ducati racing motorcycle, private jet flights, stays at 5-star Beverly Hills hotels, cocaine-fueled parties in Las Vegas, escort services, and gourmet meals, all in exchange for running unauthorized database searches and warning criminals when they were under federal investigation. The bribes were allegedly paid by Edgar Sargsyan, a Beverly Hills attorney who prosecutors would later reveal had never legitimately passed the California bar exam, instead paying another lawyer $20,000 per month to study and then take the test using fake identification. Brumond's fall represented more than just another case of corruption. It exposed how organized crime had successfully infiltrated multiple layers of federal law enforcement in Southern California, placing FBI agents, Homeland Security investigators, and local police detectives on their payroll at the same time. Babak Brumond was born in Iran in approximately 1966, during a tumultuous period in that nation's history. As he would later tell a federal judge, he fled persecution in his home country, immigrating to the United States, where he fell in love with American freedom and adopted the country as his own. The details of his early life and education remain largely private, but what is known is that Brumond harbored dreams of serving his adopted homeland in uniform. When his family refused to allow him to join the U.S. Armed Forces, Brumond redirected his ambitions toward federal law enforcement. In January 1999, at age 33, he joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a special agent, beginning what would become a 20-year career that would take him to some of the world's most dangerous locations. Brumond was assigned to the FBI's San Francisco field office, where he was entrusted with some of the Bureau's most sensitive and critical work: national security investigations and the recruitment and handling of confidential human intelligence. Sources: Human. This was not desk work or routine criminal investigation. Brumond's responsibilities placed him at the front of counterterrorism and counterintelligence operations, work that required him to land into global hotbeds of violence and corruption to recruit sources who could provide intelligence on threats to American national security. By all accounts, Brumond excelled in this demanding role. He rose to the position of supervisory special agent, overseeing other agents working on HUMINT operations. His personnel file documented numerous commendations for his work. As he would later remind a sentencing judge, his intelligence reports had made it to the White House. The CIA had even attempted to recruit him as an intelligence officer, a testament to his skills and reputation in the intelligence community. Brumond built what appeared to be a stable family life in Lafayette, a place in the East Bay area of the San Francisco Bay. He married Malamatinia Mavromatis, an attorney, and together they started a business in 2007 called Love Bugs LLC, a lice removal hair salon that operated in Lafayette. The business appeared to be a modest side venture, in addition to Brumond's FBI salary. On the surface, the couple represented the American success story, an immigrant who had risen through hard work to serve his country at the highest levels of law enforcement. But beneath this veneer of success, Brumond had expensive tastes that would prove to be his undoing. Those who encountered him socially noticed his affinity for luxury goods: the Rolex watches, Gucci belts, designer clothes, and appreciation for the finer things in life. For someone earning a government salary, even as a supervisory special agent, These preferences created a financial vulnerability that a skilled predator could exploit. The transformation of Babak Brumond from decorated FBI agent to corrupt criminal asset began in the Grand Havana Room, a members-only cigar lounge tucked away in Beverly Hills. In the fall of 2014, he found himself there, mingling with a man who would change the course of his life. Edgar Sargsyan. Sargsyan was a 38-year-old Armenian organized crime figure who operated under the cover of being a successful Beverly Hills attorney. From offices on Rodeo Drive, adorned with photographs of himself alongside prominent politicians, including President Barack Obama, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, California Governor Gavin Newsom, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sargsyan ran The Pillar Law Group. What Brumond didn't know at the time, or chose not to investigate, was that Sargsyan had never legitimately passed the California bar exam. Instead, he had paid a colleague, Henrik Mosesi, $20,000 per month to study for the test, then made a fake California driver's license for Mosesi to present at a Sacramento testing center in February 2015, where Mosesi deliberately smudged his fingerprints before taking the exam in Sargsyan's name. Sargsyan was running what prosecutors would describe as a massive credit card fraud operation. He and his associates were stealing the identities of foreign nationals who had visited the United States on J-1 visas, using these stolen identities to open credit card accounts, and then conducting bust-out schemes that charged millions of dollars in fraudulent purchases. Sargsyan would later testify that he had stolen millions upon millions of dollars through these schemes over approximately a decade. But Sargsyan was more than just a con artist. He was a talent scout for organized crime, specifically tasked with recruiting corrupt law enforcement officials who could provide protection and intelligence. When he met Brumond at the Grand Havana Room, Sargsyan's trained eye immediately noted the FBI agent's expensive tastes. The Rolex watch on Brumond's wrist, the Gucci belt around his waist, the obvious appreciation for luxury goods and services. These were not the accessories of a man content to live within a government salary. Sargsyan navigated the relationship carefully. Later, in 2014, he invited Brumond to a party he was hosting at a rented mansion in Las Vegas. The friendship developed over subsequent months. Sargsyan was generous, charming, and well-connected. He moved in elite circles, hosted fundraisers for politicians, flew on private jets, and seemed to embody success. For Brumond, whose work had him recruiting and managing confidential sources, the relationship may have seemed like a potential intelligence opportunity. A well-connected individual who moved in Armenian circles and might provide valuable information. Then, in early 2015, Sargsyan made his move. According to the criminal complaint and Sargsyan's later testimony, he told Brumond directly that he was engaged in criminal activity. This was the moment of truth. A legitimate FBI agent, upon learning that a social contact was involved in crime, would immediately report this information and potentially open an investigation, or try to flip the individual as a cooperating source through official channels. Instead, Sargsyan asked Brumond if he would be interested in doing a little something on the side. Brumond, according to Sargsyan's testimonies, said he was game. The initial request was straightforward. Sargsyan asked Brumond to search for Sargsyan's own name in FBI databases and to diffuse any law enforcement interest in him. For an experienced FBI agent like Brumond, this was an obviously improper request. Searching FBI databases for a personal acquaintance without a legitimate investigative purpose violated bureau policy. Conducting such a search for someone who had admitted to criminal activity and was seeking to evade law enforcement was a federal crime. Brumond allegedly complied. In response, he told Sargsyan that he had been the subject of an FBI investigation into credit card fraud in 2008 or 2009, information that would only be available if Brumond had illegally searched for Sargsyan's name in law enforcement databases. Sargsyan began paying Brumond approximately $10,000 per month in cash for information and protection, according to court documents. The arrangement was clear. Brumond would query law enforcement databases for individuals Sargsyan was concerned about, warned Sargsyan to stay away from anyone under investigation, and generally provide an early warning system that would allow Sargsyan and his associates to avoid law enforcement detection. The first major test came quickly. Sargsyan asked Brumond to search for Levon Termengian, also known as Lev Aslan Dermen, an Armenian organized crime figure for whom Sargsyan had worked. Termengian was a major target, and the database search, according to the affidavit, rang all the bells, revealing an active FBI investigation in Los Angeles. Brumond accessed the FBI case file on Termengian repeatedly in January 2015, and again in May 2016, providing Sargsyan with detailed intelligence about federal law enforcement's interest in the crime boss. As the scheme continued through 2015 and into 2016, the bribes and gifts escalated. Sargsyan purchased a Ducati motorcycle and accessories valued at more than $36,000 for Brumond as a bonus after Brumond vetted a member of the Qatari royal family, checking databases to ensure the individual wasn't on the terrorist watch list. Sargsyan also provided Brumond with private jet flights, including trips to Las Vegas, where, according to testimony and court filings, the two engaged in cocaine-fueled parties and sex romps paid for by the criminal attorney. Brumond stayed at luxury hotels, including the Beverly Hills Hotel and Beverly Wilshire, with Sargsyan covering the bills. Escort services were provided. Gourmet meals at exclusive restaurants became routine. To hide these cash payments, Brumond funneled money through the Love Bugs LLC lice removal business he operated with his wife. One payment was a $30,000 cashier's check made payable to Love Bugs, which Brumond used as part of a down payment on a $1.3 million vacation home near Lake Tahoe. When later questioned about this payment, Brumond would offer various explanations, first claiming it was from a boat sale, then insisting it was a loan. The corruption spread beyond just database searches. In December 2015, at Sargsyan's request, Brumond searched confidential FBI databases for information about Sam Sarkis Solakian, a medical imaging company's CEO. Brumond subsequently warned Sargsyan to stay away from Solakian because he was trouble, meaning under law enforcement investigation. This warning proved prescient when Solakian was later charged, tried, convicted, and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for running a scheme that submitted more than $250 million in fraudulent claims through California's workers' compensation system. Perhaps most brazenly, in May 2016, Brumond actively interfered with an FBI investigation into Felix Cisneros Jr., a corrupt special agent with Homeland Security investigations, who was also on Sargsyan's payroll. According to court documents, Brumond grew worried that Cisneros might be under investigation. So he ran Cisneros' name through confidential FBI databases and discovered there was indeed an active corruption investigation. Rather than report this to his supervisors or distance himself from the compromised agent, Brumond was now using FBI resources to protect other corrupt federal agents. The criminal conspiracy between Babak Brumond and Edgar Sargsyan represented a comprehensive betrayal of the FBI agent's oath and a systematic corruption of federal law enforcement databases for the benefit of Armenian organized crime. The crimes unfolded across multiple categories and involved numerous specific criminal acts between January 2015 and December 2018. At the heart of Brumond's criminal conduct was a conspiracy with Sargsyan and others to accept bribes in exchange for official acts. This conspiracy involved an agreement that Brumond would perform official acts and omit to do acts, query law enforcement databases, provide Sargsyan with non-public law enforcement sensitive information and protection, and assist Sargsyan in evading detection by law enforcement. The conspiracy continued for nearly 4 years, during which both men took active steps to conceal their corrupt relationship from Brumond's FBI superiors and other law enforcement agencies. Sargsyan paid Brumond approximately $10,000 per month in cash throughout much of the conspiracy period. These payments totaled at least $150,000 in direct cash and check payments. The money was delivered during Brumond's trips to Southern California, where he would stay at luxury hotels paid for by Sargsyan. Brumond also engaged in structured cash deposits, breaking up large sums into smaller deposits to avoid triggering currency transaction reports that banks are required to file with the federal government. This structuring itself constituted a separate federal crime, as it was designed to evade financial reporting requirements. Beyond cash, Brumond accepted items and services valued at well over $100,000. Each of these gifts and services was provided with the understanding that Brumond would continue to provide protection and intelligence to Sargsyan and his criminal associates. Brumond also conducted numerous unauthorized searches of confidential FBI databases, each search representing a separate violation of federal law and FBI policy. Each search violated the FBI's strict policies about when and why agents may access confidential databases. These databases contain some of America's most sensitive law enforcement and national security information, including details of ongoing investigations, intelligence about threats, and information that could compromise undercover operations or endanger confidential sources. By selling access to these systems, Brumond not only committed crimes, but potentially endangered lives and active investigations. In May 2016, Brumond actively interfered with an FBI investigation into Felix Cisneros Jr., the corrupt Homeland Security Investigations (HSI) agent who was also on Sargsyan's payroll. When Brumond became concerned that Cisneros might be under investigation, likely because of their association at parties and events paid for by Sargsyan, he ran Cisneros' name through FBI databases and discovered an active corruption investigation. This represented a clearly organized crime operation that had successfully penetrated federal law enforcement at multiple agencies, creating a protective shield around Sargsyan's criminal activities and those of his associates, including Armenian. Organized crime boss Levon Termenjian. The three corrupt officers would socialize together, attending parties in Las Vegas, dining at the Grand Havana Room in Beverly Hills, and traveling together, all on Sargsyan's money. Photos introduced as evidence at trial showed Brumond, Cisneros, and Balian together at these events, documenting their corrupt relationships. The unraveling of Babak Brumond's criminal scheme began with small anomalies that drew the attention of investigators, and with the cooperation of the very man who had corrupted him. The first red flag emerged when a Southern California police agency seized an FBI parking placard during a traffic stop or investigation. When investigators traced the placard back to Brumond, questions arose about why his official FBI credentials were in the possession of someone outside the bureau. This seemingly minor incident prompted closer scrutiny of Brumond's activities and associations. Meanwhile, Edgar Sargsyan was facing his own legal problems. The fake lawyer's criminal empire was beginning to crumble under the weight of multiple federal investigations. Authorities were closing in on Levon Termenjian's massive renewable fuel tax credit fraud scheme, a $1 billion fraud involving a Mormon sect called the Order. Sargsyan, as Termenjian's former attorney and associate, knew he was exposed. According to court documents and testimony, Sargsyan became increasingly paranoid that Termenjian, often called the Lion by associates, was hunting him. He heard from his Rodeo Drive law office that Termenjian and his goons had shown up looking for him. Fearing for his life, Sargsyan hired off-duty Beverly Hills police officers to provide security and began using his corrupt law enforcement contacts, including Brumond, to gather intelligence on Termenjian that might help him survive. Sargsyan eventually thought that the only way to escape alive was to cooperate with federal authorities. He approached investigators and offered to turn state's evidence against Termenjian, the corrupt officers on his payroll, and the broader criminal enterprise. Sargsyan's cooperation provided investigators with detailed inside information about the corruption scheme. He described the parties in Las Vegas, the cash payments, the database searches, the gifts and bribes. He turned over records, photos, and communications documenting his relationships with Brumond, Cisneros, and Balian. In 2018, federal agents executed search warrants on Brumond's home in Lafayette and on the Love Bugs LLC business locations. These searches would have given investigators access to financial records, communications, and other evidence documenting the corrupt relationship. Shortly after the search warrants were executed, Brumond retired from the FBI. His 20-year career ended not with commendations, but under a cloud of suspicion. The timing was not coincidental, and Brumond knew investigators were closing in. After leaving the FBI, Brumond took a position as a staff investigator at the University of California, Berkeley, working in the Office of Investigations. According to his LinkedIn profile, he was responsible for handling whistleblower allegations of improper governmental activities and investigating sexual harassment and sexual violence allegations. Deeply ironic positions for someone under federal investigation for corruption. The investigation continued for nearly 2 years as prosecutors built their case. Investigators corroborated Sargsyan's testimony with documentary evidence. Bank records showing the payments to Love Bugs LLC. Database logs showing Brumond's unauthorized searches. Hotel records documenting Brumond's stays at luxury hotels. Photos from parties and events showing Brumond socializing with Sargsyan and other corrupt officers, and communications documenting the corrupt relationship. On April 21, 2020, a federal grand jury in Los Angeles handed down a sealed criminal complaint charging Brumond with conspiracy to commit bribery of a public official. On Friday, April 24, 2020, special agents with the FBI and the Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General moved in to arrest Brumond near his Lafayette home. Brumond was initially charged with 1 count of conspiracy to commit bribery of a public official. He made his initial court appearance on Monday, April 27, 2020, via telephone from jail in federal court in San Francisco. The conspiracy charge alone carried a statutory maximum penalty of 5 years in federal prison. As the investigation progressed and prosecutors prepared for trial, additional charges were added. The government built a comprehensive case documenting not just the conspiracy, but specific instances of bribery and money laundering. The investigation revealed the full scope of the corruption network. Glendale Police Detective John Cerro Balian pleaded guilty to obstruction and bribery charges in 2018. HSI. Agent Felix Cisneros was convicted at trial in 2 separate cases. The first in 2018 for corrupt acts on behalf of Termengen, the second for corrupt acts on behalf of Sargsyan. Cisneros was sentenced to over 10 years in federal prison in November 2022. Edgar Sargsyan pleaded guilty in July 2020 to 2 counts of bribing a public official, 2 counts of making false statements to federal investigators, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. His cooperation with prosecutors earned him a relatively lenient sentence, but his plea agreement required him to testify against Brumond and the others. In August 2020, Levon Termengen was convicted in Utah federal court on charges related to the $1 billion renewable fuel tax credit fraud scheme. The conviction of the Armenian organized crime boss represented a major victory for federal prosecutors and validated the investigation that had exposed the corrupt officers on his payroll. Babak Brumond's trial began on September 20, 2022, in United States District Court for the Central District of California in Los Angeles, more than 2 years after his arrest. The delay had been partly due to COVID-19 pandemic-related court closures, and partly due to pre-trial motions and legal maneuvering. The trial lasted 11 days and featured dramatic testimony and extensive documentary evidence. The prosecution's case was presented by assistant U.S. attorneys who laid out the corrupt relationship between Brumond and Sargsyan. Prosecutors introduced photographs as exhibits showing Brumond, Cisneros, and Balian together in Las Vegas in January 2016 and at the Grand Havana Room in May 2016, celebrating Sargsyan's bar admission. These photos visually documented the corrupt relationships and the lavish lifestyle Sargsyan was providing. Bank records were introduced, showing payments to Love Bugs LLC, including the $30,000 cashier's check used for the Lake Tahoe home down payment. FBI database logs documented Brumond's searches for Sargsyan, Termengian, Solakian, Cisneros, and others. Searches that had no legitimate investigative purpose. The prosecution also called FBI agents and investigators who testified about proper procedures for database searches, the strict protocols governing when agents can access confidential information, and how Brumond had violated these policies. Expert witnesses explained the sensitivity of the information in these databases and the harm caused when it is compromised. Henrik Mosesi, the attorney who had allegedly taken the bar exam for Sargsyan, was called as a witness, but invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and refused to answer questions. His refusal to testify was noted by prosecutors and defense alike as evidence of ongoing criminal exposure. In a risky move, Brumond took the stand in his own defense. He denied that he had conducted the database searches in exchange for bribes, insisting that he believed Sargsyan could provide valuable intelligence and that he was properly developing him as a source. Brumond maintained that he had not known Sargsyan was involved in criminal activity when their relationship began. Prosecutor Michael Morse characterized Brumond's defense as fanciful, fantastical claims from a spy novel. The evidence of monthly cash payments, the Ducati motorcycle as a bonus, the Lake Tahoe home purchased with bribe money, and the structured deposits to conceal income all pointed to a corrupt scheme, not legitimate law enforcement work. On October 4, 2022, after deliberating on the extensive evidence, the federal jury returned its verdict. Brumond was found guilty on 4 counts. 1 count of conspiracy to commit bribery of a public official, 2 counts of bribery of a public official, and 1 count of monetary transactions in property derived from specified unlawful activity, money laundering. The conviction carried severe statutory maximum penalties, 15 years in federal prison for each bribery count, 10 years for the money laundering count, and 5 years for the conspiracy count. A possible total of 45 years in prison. On February 27, 2023, Babak Brumond appeared before U.S. District Judge Gary Klausner for sentencing. Federal prosecutors had requested a 10-year prison sentence, arguing that Brumond's crimes represented a profound betrayal of public trust and had potentially compromised national security investigations. They emphasized that as a supervisor responsible for recruiting confidential sources and conducting national security work, Brumond's corruption was particularly egregious. The defense, led by Stephen Gruhl, urged Judge Klausner to consider Brumond's 20-year career with the FBI, his numerous commendations, the dangerous assignments he had undertaken, and the intelligence work that had reached the White House. Letters of support were submitted by high-profile FBI figures, and Gruhl argued for leniency based on Brumond's past service. Judge Klausner sentenced Brumond to 6 years in federal prison, 4 years less than prosecutors had requested, but still a substantial sentence reflecting the seriousness of the crimes. The judge also ordered Brumond to pay a $30,000 fine and to forfeit $132,309 linked to the criminal activity. Most directly, the integrity of ongoing FBI investigations had been compromised. When Brumond warned Sargsyan to stay away from Sam Sarkis Solakian because he was under investigation, it potentially allowed Solakian to alter his behavior, destroy evidence, or otherwise obstruct justice. The same was true for Levon Termengian and others whose names Brumond had searched. The American people were also victims of Brumond's betrayal. FBI agents are entrusted with some of the nation's most sensitive secrets and given access to powerful investigative tools precisely because they are expected to use these resources only for legitimate law enforcement purposes. When an agent sells that access, it undermines public trust in federal law enforcement and in the FBI as an institution. Other FBI agents and law enforcement officers were victims as well. Brumond's corruption made their jobs harder by reinforcing beliefs about law enforcement corruption and by potentially compromising investigations they were working on. The dedication and integrity of thousands of honest agents was tarnished by association with Brumond's crimes. The workers in California's workers' compensation system were indirect victims. since Brumond's warning to Sargsyan about Salakian may have allowed that fraud to continue longer, ultimately defrauding the system of more than $250 million. Renewable fuel tax fraud that Turmengen was involved in defrauded American taxpayers of approximately $1 billion. Even Brumond's own family were victims. His wife, Malamatinia, and their children had to endure the shame and public disgrace of his conviction, the financial hardship of his imprisonment, and the permanent stain on the family name. At the same sentencing hearing, statements from law enforcement officials emphasized the broader harm. Today's sentencing of Mr. Brumond, a former FBI agent who abandoned his pledge to serve the American people in exchange for a lavish lifestyle, is gratifying and reaffirms the FBI's commitment to weeding out corruption of public officials, including those from within, said Donald Alway, Assistant Director in charge of the FBI's Los Angeles Field Office. Darren Lian, Special Agent in charge of the IRS Criminal Investigations Oakland Field Office, stated, "Every law enforcement officer took an oath to never betray their integrity and to enforce the law with fairness and justice when they enter this profession. Unfortunately, Babak Brumond betrayed that oath and violated the trust bestowed on him by the American people when he released sensitive law enforcement information in exchange for money, gifts, and other personal benefits. Today's sentence shows that no one is above the law, and those who dare to cross the line will be held responsible for their unlawful actions." Following his February 2023 sentencing, Babak Brumond began serving his 6-year federal prison sentence. However, his legal troubles were far from over, and his time in custody would be surprisingly brief. In late 2023 or early 2024, federal prosecutors brought additional charges against Brumond and his wife, Malamatinia, related to money laundering through the Lovebugs LLC business. The couple was accused of using the unlicensed lice removal company to launder underworld bribe money, specifically the funds used to purchase the Lake Tahoe vacation home. In what was described as a confidential plea agreement, Brumond pleaded guilty to a tax charge connected to laundering bribe money through Lovebugs. As part of this agreement, charges against his wife were dismissed on the condition that she stay out of trouble for 1 year. The details of this plea agreement remain largely sealed from public view. The most stunning development came in December 2025, when Brumond was released from federal custody after serving approximately 30 months, just 2.5 years of his 6-year sentence. His attorney, Stephen Gruel, confirmed that Brumond's sentence had been reduced, but declined to provide details about how or why such a substantial reduction was granted. Mr. Brumond served approximately 30 months in federal prison. He is returning to and rebuilding his life and career, Gruel stated, adding that he was happy for his client. The circumstances surrounding the early release remain unclear. It may have involved cooperation with authorities on other matters, credit for time served while awaiting trial, or other factors not disclosed in public court records. According to reports, despite being a convicted felon who pleaded guilty to laundering bribe money to purchase it, Brumond was allowed to keep the Lake Tahoe vacation home. This aspect of his case drew criticism from those who felt that assets purchased with criminal proceeds should have been forfeited. As of December 2025, Brumond is a free man attempting to rebuild his life. The specifics of what he is doing professionally and where he is living remain largely private. His conviction means he can never work in law enforcement again, and his felony status creates significant barriers to many types of employment. The broader impact of the Brumond case continues to resonate. His conviction was part of a larger cleanup of corruption in Southern California law enforcement connected to Armenian organized crime. Edgar Sargsyan was sentenced in December 2023 to just 6 months in prison, followed by 6 months of home detention. A remarkably light sentence given his extensive criminal history, likely reflecting his cooperation against Brumond and others. Sargsyan was disbarred by the California State Bar in November 2024. Felix Cisneros Jr., the corrupt HSI agent, is serving more than 10 years in federal prison for his convictions in 2 separate bribery cases. John Cerro Balian, the Glendale police detective, served approximately 1 year of a nearly 2-year sentence for obstruction and bribery. Levon Termengen, the Lion, was convicted in the $1 billion renewable fuel tax credit fraud and remains in jail. The case exposed how, once again, organized crime had successfully corrupted multiple layers of law enforcement at the same time, placing agents from different agencies on the payroll to create a protective shield. This revelation prompted reforms in how agencies monitor unusual database searches and how they vet the relationships between agents and potential sources. For the FBI, the Brumond case represented a painful reminder that no organization is immune to corruption. The Bureau's internal investigation capabilities and willingness to prosecute one of its own demonstrated institutional integrity. But the case also raised questions about supervision and oversight. The relatively light sentence Brumond ultimately served, just 30 months for crimes that carried a potential maximum of 45 years, raised concerns about whether the punishment adequately reflected the seriousness of his betrayal. Critics argued that corrupt law enforcement officers should face especially severe penalties, given the unique position of trust they occupy. The Brumond case remains a story about the dangers of greed and the vulnerability of even experienced law enforcement officers to corruption. His transformation from decorated FBI agent to convicted felon who sold America's secrets for a Ducati motorcycle and cocaine-fueled Vegas parties represents one of the most significant betrayals in modern FBI history. The case also highlighted the ability of modern organized crime in identifying and exploiting weaknesses in law enforcement. Edgar Sargsyan's ability to recognize Brumond's expensive tastes and systematically corrupt him demonstrated a level of tradecraft that law enforcement agencies must be vigilant against. As Brumond attempts to rebuild his life as a free man, the legacy of his crimes endures. Compromised investigations, eroded public trust, and a permanent stain on the reputation of the FBI agents who serve with honor. If you enjoyed this deep dive into every FBI agent who protected criminals, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.